I found the factory by accident, which felt appropriate given how completely the world had moved on without it. I was skirting the edge of town, avoiding the main streets where sound carried too easily, when the rusted outline appeared through a line of dead trees. A sagging chain-link fence leaned inward like it had given up years ago. Beyond it, a massive concrete building sat low and quiet, its windows dark, its name half peeled off the brick facade. This place hadn't burned. It hadn't been looted down to bones. It hadn't been claimed by anyone loud enough to leave a mark. It had simply been abandoned, slowly, the way towns die before people notice. That alone made me stop. The front gate was locked, but the lock had fused into the metal from weather long before the outbreak. I slipped through a gap where the fence had collapsed and stood still, listening. No shuffling, no distant moans, just wind moving through broken glass somewhere deep inside the structure. Silence, with depth to it. The factory sprawled wider than it first appeared. Loading bays lined one side, their roll-up doors bent or frozen halfway open. A rail spur cut through cracked asphalt, weeds growing between the ties. The building smelled like oil, dust, and time. It smelled untouched. I circled the exterior slowly, counting entrances without meaning to. Too many windows, too many doors, too many ways for things to go wrong. Still, the walls were thick, poured concrete reinforced with age and neglect. The roofline was low and flat, hard to climb without effort. From a distance, the place blended into the industrial decay surrounding it, invisible unless you knew to look. That invisibility mattered. Inside, the scale hit me all at once. Machinery sat where it had been left, belts hanging loose, rust creeping along edges. The floor was littered with debris but not footprints. No signs of recent scavenging. No dragged bodies. The silence inside was different from outdoors. Heavier, layered with echoes that folded back on themselves. I moved slowly, testing each step, letting my eyes adjust. The factory wasn't one open room. It was a maze of production floors, offices, storage cages, and overhead catwalks. Some sections were pitch black. Others caught pale daylight through broken skylights. There were places to hide here, places to retreat, places to fortify if you had the time and nerve. That was the thought that lodged itself in my head and refused to leave. Every shelter I'd used before had been temporary by design. Houses, stores, vehicles. You stayed until the noise caught up, or supplies ran out, or someone else decided they wanted it more than you did. Movement had been safety. Stay too long and you became a target. This place felt different. Not safe, never safe, but defensible in a way nothing else had been. The factory wasn't convenient. It wasn't comfortable. It demanded work before it offered anything in return. That demand filtered out the desperate and the careless. Zombies followed sound and light. Survivors followed rumor and ease. This place offered neither. I climbed a staircase to a second-level office and looked out through cracked glass at the town beyond the trees. From here, the factory vanished into the landscape. You wouldn't stumble onto it. You wouldn't notice it unless you were already looking for something forgotten. I sat on the floor and let myself breathe for the first time that day. The realization came slowly, unsettling in its calm. I wasn't just looking at shelter. I was looking at a decision. Staying meant committing to a place that could fail in 1,000 quiet ways. Leaving meant continuing a pattern that had already cost me more than I liked to remember. The factory didn't promise survival. It didn't offer certainty. It offered something rarer. Time, space, the possibility of control, earned the hard way instead of borrowed. As I stood there in the dust and silence, I understood why no one else had taken it. It was too much work, too many unknowns, too easy to walk past and keep moving. That was exactly why I couldn't. I didn't decide to stay all at once. The idea crept in gradually, threading itself through practical thoughts until it felt less like a choice and more like a conclusion I kept circling back to. I told myself I was just resting, just using the factory as cover while I planned my next move. That lie worked for a few hours. Movement had kept me alive this long. That was the rule I'd followed without questioning it. You stayed light, you didn't get attached. You slept where you could and left before familiarity turned into risk. Every place I'd trusted before had eventually betrayed me, not because it was bad shelter, but because it wasn't meant to last. Standing inside the factory, that pattern felt suddenly exhausted. I walked its perimeter again, slower this time, not scanning for threats but for possibilities. The loading docks could be sealed. The inner offices could be cleared and controlled. The main production floor was too open, but the smaller adjoining rooms offered depth. The more I looked, the more my mind shifted from escape routes to fallback positions. That change scared me more than any noise outside ever had. Staying meant accepting responsibility for a place. It meant learning its weaknesses, maintaining it, defending it. It meant risk that accumulated instead of resetting every time I moved on. If something went wrong here, it wouldn't be a clean break. It would be a collapse. But moving on wasn't clean either, and it just spread the damage thinner. I thought about the last time I'd abandoned a good spot because it felt temporary. I'd left food behind because I didn't want to carry the weight. I'd ignored a chance to reinforce a door because I planned to leave anyway. 2 days later, I'd been running through a storm with nothing but what fit in my pockets, wishing I'd been wrong. The factory forced a different question. Not, can I survive tonight? But, can I make this survivable tomorrow? I sat on a metal crate and listened to the building settle. No movement. No distant sounds pulling me forward, just space. Space that could be shaped or wasted. Staying would slow me down. It would make me predictable. If someone else found this place, they'd know I'd invested in it. That made me visible in a way constant motion never did. But visibility wasn't the same as vulnerability. Movement created noise, mistakes, fatigue. This place offered rest if I earned it. I ran through the alternatives. The town beyond the trees was stripped bare. The roads were funnels for sound and trouble. Houses collapsed under scrutiny. Vehicles failed when you needed them most. Everything familiar came with expectations the world no longer honored. The factory had no expectations. It didn't pretend to be safe. It didn't suggest comfort. It sat there unchanged, offering only what effort could extract from it. Walls, height, distance from casual discovery. Those were real advantages, not hopes. I imagined waking up here more than once, learning the sounds of the building, knowing which echoes meant nothing and which meant movement. I imagined building something incremental, imperfect but intentional. Not a fortress, a refusal to keep running. The weight of that thought settled heavy and undeniable. Staying wasn't about believing I could make this place impenetrable. It was about choosing to stop burning energy on uncertainty and start spending it on control. I stood up and walked back to the entrance I'd used, looking at it with different eyes. This wasn't a temporary doorway anymore. It was a threshold. If I stayed, there would be no one to blame when things failed, no excuse to pack up and disappear without consequence. Every mistake would be mine, every improvement too. That responsibility felt terrifying. It also felt honest. By the time the light began to fade through the broken skylights, the debate was over, even if I hadn't said it out loud yet. I wasn't passing through. I wasn't waiting for a better option. I was choosing to stay, not because the factory was safe, but because it was the first place in a long time that offered the chance to stop reacting and start deciding. That choice didn't calm me. It anchored me. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't thinking about where I'd go next. I was thinking about what it would take to make this place hold. Night arrived without ceremony, slipping through broken skylights and high windows until the factory's interior dimmed into layered shadow. I hadn't lit anything yet. Fire felt like an announcement, and I wasn't ready to introduce myself to the dark. I stayed still for a while, letting my eyes adjust, listening as the building revealed itself one sound at a time. Empty spaces don't stay silent. They breathe. Metal cooled and shifted, releasing soft pops that echoed longer than they should have. Somewhere above me, loose sheet metal tapped against a beam in a slow, irregular rhythm. Wind pushed through a cracked vent, producing a low whistle that rose and fell like distant movement. Every noise arrived amplified, bounced, then returned slightly altered, as if the factory was testing my reactions. I chose a second-floor office for the night, one with 3 intact walls and a door that still closed. The glass had long ago shattered, but the frame remained, offering a narrow view of the production floor below. From there I could see without being seen easily. Height mattered. Distance mattered. I dragged a desk across the doorway, not to stop anything serious, just to buy seconds, if I needed them. Lying down felt unnatural. My body resisted rest, wired to listen for danger. I stayed seated at first, back against the wall, knees pulled in, watching the darkness beyond the doorway. The factory felt enormous now that I wasn't moving through it. Its size pressed in, making me aware of how small one person was inside it. Memory filled the quiet. Past shelters surfaced uninvited. Houses with doors that never quite closed. Stores with too many windows. Cars that smelled like desperation and rust. Each one had offered comfort briefly before forcing me to leave. I waited for that familiar itch, the urge to keep moving before something found me. It didn't come. Instead, there was a different sensation, unfamiliar and unsettling. Possibility. The factory wasn't trying to hide me. It was waiting to be shaped. That thought carried weight. It meant responsibility had already begun, whether I acted on it or not. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through the background noise, distinct enough to freeze my breath. A scrape. Slow. Deliberate. I leaned forward, heart hammering, straining to isolate it from the building's normal language. It came again, closer this time, then stopped. I waited. Minutes stretched thin. The silence returned, unbroken. Eventually I realized what it was. A loose door on the far end of the structure, moving with the wind, dragging against concrete. The relief that followed was sharp, almost painful. My hands shook slightly as adrenaline drained away. That moment taught me something important. Fear here would be constant, but it wouldn't always be justified. Learning the difference would matter more than strength or weapons. The factory demanded attention, not panic. I finally lay down on the cold floor, using my pack as a pillow. Sleep came in fragments. I drifted off, woke at every unfamiliar sound, then settled again. Each time I woke, the building was still there, unchanged, indifferent to my presence. That consistency began to work in my favor. Just before dawn, pale light crept through the skylights, turning shadows into shapes I could recognize. The factory looked less threatening in daylight, its vastness clearer, its flaws more obvious. I sat up slowly, stiff and tired, but intact. I had made it through the night. That alone didn't mean the factory was viable. One night proved nothing long-term. But it proved enough. It showed me that the space could be endured, that fear didn't automatically translate into danger, and that staying hadn't immediately punished me for the decision. As morning settled in, I stood and looked out over the empty floor again. The place still wasn't safe. It was still unfinished, but it had held for a night, and that felt like the smallest possible foundation something larger could be built on. The factory hadn't rejected me. That was more than I'd gotten from most places. Now it was my turn to decide whether I would earn the space I'd taken, or just pass another night waiting for the world to force my hand again. Morning light stripped the factory of mystery and replaced it with problems. In daylight, the place revealed itself honestly, without shadow or imagination to soften its flaws. I moved through it slowly, not searching for comfort but for failure points. Anything I didn't understand here would betray me later. The perimeter came first. Every entrance mattered now. The loading docks were the most obvious vulnerability. Wide mouths designed for trucks, not defense. Some doors were bent, others frozen half open, one completely missing. I marked each one mentally, ranking them by urgency. If something wanted in, this was where it would try. Windows came next. There were too many to count at first glance, lining the upper walls like broken teeth. Most were shattered, some boarded from years ago, others open to the elements. I tested reach, sightlines, angles. Zombies didn't climb well, but they pressed, piled, and broke things through persistence. Glass offered no real barrier. Height did. Inside, the factory's layout became a map of control and exposure. The main production floor was a liability. Too open. Too many blind angles. Sound travelled freely there, bouncing and multiplying. If something breached the perimeter, that space would amplify chaos. I decided early it would never be my primary living area. It was a buffer, nothing more. The smaller rooms told a different story. Storage cages with thick steel mesh, offices with solid walls, maintenance corridors barely wide enough for two people to pass. These were defensible by design, meant to restrict movement and visibility. I walked them repeatedly, counting steps, noting corners where something could appear without warning. Overhead access worried me most. Catwalks crossed sections of the factory like exposed veins. Ladders led to the roof through unlocked hatches. From up there, the entire interior could be observed or invaded. I climbed each ladder carefully, testing rusted rungs with my full weight before trusting them. The roof itself was flat, surrounded by low parapet walls, with multiple vents large enough for a person to squeeze through. Too many ways down. Too many places I couldn't see from below. I started dividing the space in my head not into rooms, but into zones. Areas I could afford to lose. Areas I would never retreat past. Lines drawn not with tape or paint, but with intention. Defense wasn't about stopping everything. It was about deciding where to make a stand, and where to fall back without hesitation. Kill zones emerged naturally once I stopped thinking emotionally. Narrow corridors with limited entry points, stairwells where momentum worked against attackers, doorways that forced bodies into predictable movement. I didn't like the term, but I understood its necessity. Planning to survive meant acknowledging that some spaces would exist purely to stop threats, not to live in. Noise discipline became part of the mapping. I clapped once in different areas and listened to how the sound travelled. Some sections swallowed it, others threw it back amplified. I dropped a piece of metal and tracked the echo's path. These tests felt crude, but they taught me which areas could hide activity and which would advertise it. I found dead ends I hadn't noticed before. Rooms with no second exit. Corners that trapped sound and movement equally. I marked those as danger spaces, places I would avoid unless absolutely necessary. Curiosity killed people faster than the infected ever did. By midday, exhaustion set in, not from physical strain, but from constant evaluation. Seeing a place only in terms of how it could fail takes a toll. Still, clarity emerged from it. The factory stopped being an overwhelming mass and became a system I could understand. I ended where I'd started, standing on the second-floor office overlooking the production floor. From here, I could see the paths I'd traced, the zones I'd claimed mentally. The factory wasn't defensible yet, not even close. But it was readable now. Knowing a place this well didn't make it safe. It made it honest. And honesty, in a world like this, was the first real layer of defense. The factory gave me walls and time, but it gave me nothing else. Everything that would make it livable had to be dragged in from a world already stripped thin. I didn't rush that realization. Rushing was how people got cornered. Instead, I planned each run the way I'd learned to plan escapes, assuming something would go wrong, and deciding in advance how much risk I was willing to carry. The town nearby had been hollowed out slowly, not burned through all at once. That worked in my favor. Stores stood empty but intact, shelves bare but structures sound. Warehouses on the industrial strip had been overlooked the same way the factory had. Too quiet. Too far from anything people cared about anymore. I moved early in the morning, before sound carried as far, before fatigue dulled judgment. Each trip had a purpose. No wandering, no curiosity. If I couldn't name what I was looking for, I didn't leave. Tools came first. Crowbars, bolt cutters, hammers, anything that could turn scrap into barrier. I found most of it in a rail maintenance shed, locked but thin-skinned. Breaking in felt louder than it should have, every metallic snap echoing longer than comfort allowed. I froze between each movement, listening for response that never came. Scrap metal followed. Chain link panels, bent shelving, sections of fencing torn loose from collapsed yards. None of it was clean or light. I cut my hands more than once, blood soaking into gloves I couldn't afford to replace. Pain became background noise, noted but ignored. The weight mattered more. Generators were harder. Most had been taken or destroyed. I found one in the back of a loading warehouse, partially dismantled, stripped for parts by someone who hadn't finished the job. Getting it free took an hour and more noise than I liked. Moving it took 2 trips and every ounce of patience I had left. I didn't test it there. I wouldn't risk sound until it was behind concrete. Fuel was rationed immediately. Whatever I carried in was stored far from where I slept. Fire was both survival and betrayal. The factory could hide me, but it couldn't hide smoke or vibration forever. Each run taught me something. How far noise traveled when I dropped something accidentally. How quickly my breathing changed when I pushed too hard. How tempting it was to grab one more item when the pack was already full. That temptation was dangerous. Greed disguised itself as efficiency. I passed bodies sometimes. Not many. The outbreak had moved through here early and moved on. I didn't linger. I didn't search pockets. Dead weight was still weight. By the 3rd run, my routes were set. I varied timing but not paths. Familiarity reduced hesitation. I memorized where shadows pooled and where sunlight gave me away. I learned which surfaces echoed and which absorbed sound. The town became a map of risks instead of memories. Dragging materials back to the factory felt different than leaving it. Every return reinforced the decision to stay. Each piece hauled through the fence gap was a small claim staked against the future. I wasn't scavenging anymore. I was supplying. Inside, the factory changed slowly with every load. Piles formed, order emerged. I stacked by use, not by type. Immediate defense near entrances. Long-term needs deeper inside. Organization became its own form of safety. Exhaustion hit hardest after I stopped moving. Muscles locked up, hands shook when I tried to eat. I learned not to collapse completely after a run. Rest came in stages, body cooled down deliberately, awareness tapering instead of dropping. On the 5th trip, I aborted early. Something felt wrong. No sound, no movement, just the sense of being observed without confirmation. I turned back without argument. Nothing followed me. That didn't matter. Survival wasn't about proving courage. It was about respecting uncertainty. By the end of the week, the factory held more than silence. It held possibility backed by effort. I hadn't secured it yet. I hadn't made it safe, but I'd begun the slow work of turning abandonment into advantage. The world had left these things behind without intention. Taking them didn't feel like theft. It felt like continuation. If the factory was going to keep me alive, this was the price. Fortifying the factory wasn't a single project. It was a series of decisions made under fatigue, each one shaped by what I could reach, lift, and secure before something noticed the noise. I worked in short bursts, never long enough to forget where I was or what I was risking. Time wasn't just limited by daylight. It was limited by attention. So, I started with the loading docks because they were the most honest threat. Wide openings invited pressure. I dragged scrap shelving and chain-link panels into place, bracing them with pallets filled with concrete chunks I'd broken loose from collapsed sections of wall. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. The goal wasn't to make entry impossible, just slow enough to give me warning and options. Every impact echoed through the building, so I learned to work around sound. Metal on metal was avoided whenever possible. When it couldn't be, I wrapped contact points with old conveyor belts and rubber matting scavenged from a nearby warehouse. The dull thud that replaced sharp clangs felt like progress. Noise discipline wasn't silence. It was control. Doors came next. Interior doors mattered more than exterior ones. I reinforced the narrow passages, creating layers rather than a single line of defense. If something got in, it wouldn't get everywhere. That principle guided every decision, containment over confrontation. Windows were a losing battle, so I chose my losses carefully. Lower-level glass was boarded from the inside, not to keep things out completely, but to prevent easy sightlines. Light leaking out was as dangerous as sound. Upper windows were left alone. Height and inaccessibility did more work than wood ever could. The work took a toll faster than I expected. My hands stayed raw despite wrapping them. Muscles screamed during lifts they'd handled easily before. I ignored most of it until a misstep on a ladder sent pain flashing through my leg sharp enough to make me freeze halfway down. I stayed there longer than necessary, breathing through it, aware of how quickly injury could end everything. That moment changed my pace. Speed was replaced with sustainability. I built in pauses, forced hydration, ate even when I didn't feel hungry. Fortification wasn't worth dying for if it prevented me from finishing it. I tested each barrier the way I expected something else would. I leaned into them, shoved, kicked, listened. Weak points revealed themselves immediately. Nails pulled loose. Braces shifted. I reinforced again, sometimes tearing down what I'd built hours earlier to rebuild it better. Pride had no place here, only function. Lighting became its own challenge. I needed enough visibility to move safely, not enough to broadcast my position. I wired battery-powered lanterns behind cover, angled down, creating pools of usable light surrounded by shadow. From the outside, the factory stayed dark. From the inside, it became navigable. The generator stayed silent. I refused to test it until the barriers reached a minimum threshold. Power would change everything, including how visible I became. Until then, effort was the only currency I spent. By the end of the second day, exhaustion set in deep and steady. The factory looked different now. Not secure, but altered. Shaped. It had edges and intentions instead of being an open invitation. That change mattered psychologically as much as physically. I stopped feeling like a trespasser and started feeling like a caretaker. Still, the clock kept ticking. Every sound risked attention. Every delay invited discovery. I worked, knowing I would not finish everything before something tested it. That knowledge sharpened priorities. Essentials first. Comfort later, if ever. As night approached, I stood at the edge of the production floor and looked at what I'd done. Barriers stood uneven but solid. Paths were narrowed. Space was reduced deliberately. The factory felt smaller, more manageable. It wasn't ready. It would never be ready in the way people imagine safety. But it was no longer passive. I shut myself into the reinforced office again that night, body aching, mind restless. Outside, the world stayed quiet. Inside, the factory held. For now, that was enough. Tomorrow would demand more. The first knock wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even loud. It came as a dull impact somewhere deep in the factory, followed by the scrape of weight shifting against metal. I froze, mid-movement. One hand still on a panel I hadn't finished securing. My breath stopped on instinct, body going rigid as my mind raced ahead of the sound. I waited. Another impact followed, heavier this time, accompanied by a wet dragging noise that didn't belong to wind or settling steel. The factory carried it differently than open space would have, rolling the sound along walls and beams until it felt closer than it actually was. That was the danger of size. Distance lied. I moved slowly toward the second-floor office, stepping only where I'd already tested the floor. From there, I angled my view down into the production area, heart thudding hard enough that I worried it might give me away. The barrier at the far loading dock shuddered once, then again. Not enough to fail, but enough to announce intent. They'd followed the construction noise from earlier. Hammering, dragging scrap. The things I'd convinced myself were controlled enough to ignore. Sound didn't care about my calculations. It carried until it found something that moved. 3 of them pressed against the chain link I'd reinforced with shelving. Their bodies leaned forward without rhythm, driven by momentum rather than coordination. One slipped, pulling another down with it. Then they rose again, repeating the motion without learning from it. Watching them was unsettling, in a way I hadn't expected. There was no urgency in them, no anger. Just persistence. The barrier bowed inward slightly. My work held, but only just. I counted seconds between impacts, listening for change. None came. This wasn't a rush. It was a test of endurance. Theirs against mine. I backed away from the open floor and retreated into the narrower corridors I'd marked earlier, positioning myself where movement would be forced and predictable. I didn't want to fight. Fighting meant sound. Sound meant more of them. I needed them to lose interest or at least fail quietly. Minutes stretched thin. The impacts continued, irregular but steady. Metal groaned. Something snapped loose and clattered to the floor, echoing far too loudly. My jaw tightened as I waited for the noise to be answered. It was. A second set of sounds joined the first, this time from another entrance I hadn't prioritized enough. The north service door rattled as weight pressed against it, hinges screaming softly under strain. The realization landed cold and immediate. They weren't responding to one noise anymore. They were responding to presence. I adjusted without thinking, moving deeper into the factory, away from both pressure points. The space I designated as expendable did its job, absorbing attention while I repositioned. This was why layers mattered. This was why no single wall should be trusted. One of the barriers finally gave. Not fully, but enough for an arm to force through, fingers clawing uselessly at air. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through me, sharp enough to taste. I stayed still, resisting the urge to act. Acting would make this worse. The arm withdrew. The body pressed again. Wood creaked. Metal bent. Then slowly, the impacts lost rhythm. One of them fell and didn't get up right away. Another shifted, redirected by something outside the factory. The sound thinned. I stayed where I was long after the noise stopped, counting breaths, forcing my muscles to unclench. Only when silence settled fully did I move again, checking each approach with care. The damage was real but contained. One barrier compromised, another stressed, no breach, no entry. The factory had passed its first test, not because it was strong, but because it had bought time. That was the lesson. Fortification wasn't about stopping the dead. It was about shaping their behavior long enough for me to stay alive. As I reinforced the weakened sections later, hands shaking from delayed fear, I understood something clearly. The factory had announced itself now. The dead knew it existed. From this point forward, silence would matter more. Efficiency would matter more. Every choice would echo. The place still held, but it was no longer invisible. And invisibility, I realized too late, had been its greatest defense. Once the noise stopped coming from outside, another kind began inside my head. The factory settled into long stretches of quiet that felt heavier than any impact against its walls. Without immediate threats to react to, my thoughts filled the space the dead had left behind. That turned out to be harder to manage than fortifying steel. Days blurred without markers. I measured time by light moving across concrete and the ache in my shoulders when I stopped working too long. Tasks that should have taken hours stretched into entire afternoons because there was no one to interrupt me, no schedule to push against. Isolation didn't arrive suddenly. It seeped in, subtle and persistent. I caught myself talking out loud while I worked. Not full conversations, just fragments, instructions, reminders. The sound of my own voice startled me every time, echoing off walls that didn't answer back. I stopped doing it after realizing how desperate it sounded in the open space. Sleep became uneven. Some nights I collapsed immediately, body shutting down before my mind could argue. Other nights I lay awake listening to the building breathe, convinced I'd hear movement that never came. Every creak felt intentional. Every distant thud pulled me halfway to my feet before logic caught up. Memories surfaced without warning. Faces I hadn't thought about in weeks appeared fully formed, as if they'd been waiting for silence to bring them back. I replayed moments that no longer mattered, decisions that couldn't be undone. The factory didn't distract me from those thoughts. It gave them room. Work became a coping mechanism. If my hands were busy, my mind stayed anchored. I reorganized supplies repeatedly, adjusting layouts that were already functional just to stay moving. I reinforced barriers that didn't need reinforcement yet. Preparation turned into ritual, not because it made the place safer, but because it kept me focused. Paranoia crept in quietly. I started checking the same door twice within minutes. I repositioned objects to test whether they'd moved when I returned. I listened for patterns in the background noise that didn't exist. Being alone removed social checks that might have corrected those instincts early. Here, every thought went unchallenged. I had to remind myself that fear without stimulus was still fear, and fear was exhausting. I forced breaks, sitting with my back against a wall, eyes closed, counting breaths until the urge to spring up faded. That discipline mattered. Losing control mentally would be faster than any physical breach. There were moments of clarity too. Standing on the catwalk one afternoon, watching light spill across the floor, I felt something close to peace. The factory was harsh and unforgiving, but it was honest. It asked for effort and gave predictability in return. That exchange felt fair in a world that had stopped being fair elsewhere. Still, the absence of people weighed on me. Not because I wanted company, but because humans are mirrors. Without them, I had no way to check whether my reactions made sense anymore. The line between caution and obsession blurred easily. I thought about leaving more than once during those quiet hours, packing what I could and slipping away before the factory became a cage instead of shelter. Each time, the thought stalled when I imagined returning to constant movement, to nights without walls and days without control. The factory demanded vigilance, but it offered continuity. To keep myself grounded, I set rules. No working after dark unless necessary. No rearranging supplies without purpose. No checking the same barrier twice in a row. These constraints weren't about efficiency. They were about preserving judgment. By the end of the week, I understood that fortifying the factory was only half the work. The other half was fortifying myself against isolation. Walls could be reinforced with steel and scrap. A mind needed structure, even when no one else was around to enforce it. The dead tested my defenses with noise and pressure. Silence tested them differently. It eroded focus, patience, and restraint. If I was going to stay here, I had to learn how to live inside quiet without letting it hollow me out. As night fell again, I sat in the same second-floor office, listening to nothing but wind against concrete. The factory stood. My barriers held. The real question, I realized, wasn't whether this place could keep the dead out. It was whether I could stay sane long enough to keep it working. The injury happened without drama, which somehow made it worse. One moment I was pulling a sheet of corrugated metal into place along a stairwell barrier. The next my grip slipped and my weight shifted wrong. Pain flared hot and immediate in my side as I slammed into the railing, breath tearing out of me in a sharp, useless gasp. I didn't fall, but the jolt sent me down to one knee, vision swimming as my body tried to decide how badly it was hurt. I stayed there longer than I should have, not moving, afraid that standing would make the damage real. The factory didn't react. No echo of movement followed, no answering noise from outside. Just my own breathing, ragged and loud in my ears. When I finally pushed myself upright, the pain stayed, deep and stubborn, radiating with every step. I finished securing the metal anyway. That choice was automatic, driven by habit more than sense. Stopping halfway felt dangerous, like leaving a sentence unfinished. By the time I was done, sweat soaked through my clothes despite the cold, and my hands shook hard enough that tightening the last bolt took 3 tries. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I shifted, pain reminded me how fragile the whole arrangement was. The factory hadn't failed me. I had failed my own limits. Injury out here wasn't an inconvenience. It was a countdown. The next day, everything took longer. Climbing ladders sent sharp warnings through my ribs. Lifting anything heavier than necessary made me stop and breathe until the ache dulled again. I adjusted my plans without fully admitting why, choosing lighter tasks, shorter work sessions, more pauses than pride wanted to allow. The cost wasn't just physical. Fear crept in alongside the pain, quiet and corrosive. What if I couldn't move fast enough next time? What if the dead returned while I was compromised? The factory demanded constant readiness. Injury turned that demand into pressure I could feel with every breath. I found myself resenting the place in small ways. The height of the ceilings, the distance between rooms, the way sound traveled unpredictably. Everything that had once felt like advantage now carried a tax. Space required movement. Movement required strength. Strength, I realized, wasn't guaranteed. That realization forced an accounting. I listed what the factory gave me and what it took. Shelter, yes. Control, mostly. Time, if I paid attention. In return, it demanded labor, vigilance, and physical risk without relief. There was no pause button. Maintenance was survival, and survival was work. I altered my defenses after that. Barriers were redesigned to require less lifting to adjust. Tools were staged closer to where they were used. I created rest points along routes I traveled often, places to sit without exposing myself. These changes weren't improvements in strength. They were admissions of limitation. The injury healed slowly, not cleanly. It left behind stiffness and a persistent awareness of vulnerability. I learned to work around it instead of through it, accepting that brute force was a finite resource. Planning became more important than effort. Efficiency replaced endurance. The factory continued to hold, but the illusion of independence cracked. I wasn't sustaining this place alone out of strength. I was negotiating with it daily, trading effort for safety in measured amounts. One miscalculation could still end everything. That knowledge stayed with me as the pain faded to a manageable echo. The factory could be fortified with scrap and strategy, but it would always exact payment. Not all at once. Not predictably, just enough to remind me that survival here wasn't free. Making the place work meant accepting that every gain carried a cost, and some of those costs came due in flesh instead of steel. I stopped thinking of the factory as a solution and started treating it like a negotiation that never ended. Each day required reassessment, restraint, and the willingness to undo work that endangered me. Survival here wasn't about proving resilience. It was about lasting without breaking, adjusting before damage became irreversible, and respecting that the body enforcing these walls was vulnerable as the walls themselves too. I knew it would happen eventually. Places that last draw attention, even when you try to disappear. The factory had survived noise, time, and the dead. That kind of persistence left traces, tracks in snow that didn't belong to me. A door left slightly off the way I'd secured it. Small signs that someone else had been close enough to notice the effort I'd put into staying hidden. The first time I saw them, I didn't announce myself. I watched from above, heart steady, in a way that surprised me. Two figures moved along the outer fence line, careful but not cautious enough. They weren't running. They weren't shouting. They walked like people who expected resistance but hoped not to find it. That was worse than desperation. I stayed still and let them test the perimeter. They tried the loading dock first, hands on metal, weight shifting as they checked for give. One of them tapped the barrier lightly. Listening. The sound echoed, and I flinched despite knowing it wouldn't draw the dead the way it once had. My defenses were being evaluated, not attacked. They spoke quietly to each other, voices too low to make out words. The way they moved told me enough. They'd seen fortified places before. They understood what walls meant. That understanding cut both ways. It meant they wouldn't rush. It also meant they wouldn't leave easily. I had options, none of them clean. I could stay hidden and hope they moved on. That risked them finding a weaker point while I waited. I could confront them loudly and force a decision fast. That invited escalation. Or I could reveal myself deliberately, on my terms, and accept whatever followed. I chose the last one, not because it felt safe, but because it felt controlled. I moved down through the interior routes I'd practiced until I reached a position where I could be seen without being reached. I stepped into view slowly, hands visible, weapons still slung, their heads snapped up immediately. One raised his hands halfway, the other froze completely. No one spoke at first. Distance did the talking. Height, barriers, angles. They couldn't rush me without effort. I couldn't disappear without retreat. The balance held, tense and fragile. I told them this place was occupied. My voice sounded strange in the open air, louder than I expected. One of them nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face before he masked it. He said they weren't here to take anything. They just wanted to talk. People always said that. I didn't invite them in. I didn't tell them to leave. I asked where they'd come from and how many there were. The answers came carefully, incomplete in ways that were intentional. They asked questions back, eyes tracking the structure behind me, measuring more than listening. Trust didn't enter the exchange. Assessment did. They said they'd been moving for weeks, that they'd lost people, that fortified places were rare and usually hostile. I believed parts of it. I didn't believe enough to lower my guard. The dead didn't care about ownership. People did. And people were unpredictable in ways walls couldn't stop once invited past them. I told them they couldn't come inside. Not yet. That the factory wasn't a refuge. It was work. If they stayed nearby, they'd draw attention. If they tried to force entry, I wouldn't hesitate. The words came out flat, practiced, even though I'd never practiced them before. They listened. After a moment, the taller one nodded again. He said they'd move back a little, set up where they could still see the place. He didn't ask permission, he didn't need it. That was the real negotiation. When they stepped away, my hands shook slightly. Not fear. Release. The factory felt smaller after that, less isolated. The walls still stood, but the illusion of solitude was gone. That night, I reinforced nothing. I sat in the office and listened, counting unfamiliar footsteps outside my perimeter. The dead weren't the only pressure anymore. The factory had done what all strongholds eventually do. It had attracted people. From that moment on, staying here would no longer be about defending against the dead alone. It would be about deciding who was allowed close enough to test the walls and how much of myself I was willing to expose to keep them standing. Letting them stay nearby was not the same as letting them in, but the difference blurred faster than I wanted. Walls are honest. They do exactly what they're built to do. People aren't like that. They adapt, probe, and wait for moments you don't know you're giving them. The first night after they arrived, I didn't sleep. I tracked movement outside the factory the way I once tracked the dead. Footsteps. Pauses. The scrape of gear being adjusted. They were careful, I'll give them that. No fires, no shouting. They understood noise discipline, which told me they'd survived longer than most. By morning, they made their presence known without crossing a line. One of them stood near the fence, far enough back to avoid looking aggressive, and raised a hand when he saw me watching from above. No approach, no demands, just acknowledgement. That restraint complicated everything. If they'd been reckless, the decision would have been easy. Force them away or prepare for conflict. Instead, they waited, and waiting created pressure of its own. Every hour they stayed increased the chance the dead would notice. Every hour they stayed increased the chance I'd have to choose between isolation and cooperation. They asked to talk again that afternoon. I agreed, keeping distance and elevation in my favor. This time they were more honest, or at least more detailed. 3 of them. 2 men, 1 woman. Light on supplies. No permanent shelter. They'd lost someone recently and weren't eager to repeat the experience. I didn't offer sympathy. Sympathy led to softness, and softness got people killed. They asked what rules I lived by here, and that question mattered. It wasn't about permission, it was about boundaries. I told them the truth. No sudden movements. No noise without purpose. No one inside without contributing. No one inside without accountability. They didn't argue. That worried me more than resistance would have. Over the next few days, we tested each other without saying so. They left small offerings near the fence, tools they didn't need, information about areas I hadn't scouted yet. I responded cautiously, acknowledging without rewarding too much, trust built in increments so small they were almost invisible. The factory changed under that pressure. Not structurally, but psychologically. I stopped thinking of it as mine alone. I started thinking about what it would cost to share it. Shared space meant shared risk. It also meant shared watch. My injury still lingered enough to remind me how thin my margin was. I let one of them inside first. Not all. Not immediately. The woman, because she moved with purpose and didn't scan the place like she was memorizing it for later use. We worked together, reinforcing a barrier I'd already planned to upgrade. I watched her hands. She didn't rush. She didn't cut corners. When she made a suggestion, it was practical, not ambitious. That earned her another hour. Trust grew through labor, not conversation. Who showed up on time, who followed instructions without testing them, who didn't wander. The others were let in gradually, always one variable at a time. If something went wrong, I needed to know exactly where it had entered. Tension never fully disappeared. It sharpened instead. We spoke plainly. Disagreements ended quickly or not at all. Authority existed because someone had to make decisions when hesitation could kill everyone. That someone happened to be me, not by claim, but by position. I hated that more than I expected. Building barriers had been straightforward. You saw a gap and closed it, and building trust meant exposing gaps on purpose and hoping they wouldn't be exploited. It required judgment instead of strength, awareness instead of certainty. By the end of the week, the factory was louder, not with chaos, but with life. Footsteps I didn't control, voices that weren't mine. The place felt stronger and more fragile at the same time. That was the cost of people. Walls could fail suddenly. People failed slowly, in ways that were harder to measure. But they also repaired things walls never could. Fatigue, blind spots, loneliness that crept in and hollowed judgment. Trust hadn't been built yet. Not fully, but something functional had taken its place. Mutual dependence, carefully managed, constantly re-evaluated. The factory was no longer just a structure I defended. It was a negotiation that renewed itself every day. The attack came at dusk, when light flattened the world into long shadows and depth became unreliable. We'd learned that timing mattered to the dead, not because they planned, but because the world betrayed us more easily then. Sound carried farther. Sight failed sooner. That was when mistakes happened. This time, we weren't caught off guard. One of them heard it first. A low moan drifting in from the direction of the rail spur, faint enough that it could have been dismissed as wind. It wasn't. Within minutes, movement followed. Shapes staggering between rusted cars drawn by the accumulated presence we'd tried so hard to manage. 3 turned into 6, 6 into more. The factory shifted from shelter to system instantly. There was no debate about roles. We moved where we'd practiced moving, bodies flowing into positions chosen days earlier. Barriers were checked, not questioned. Doors sealed in sequence. Noise was cut to the minimum required to function. This wasn't my fight alone anymore. One of them took the upper catwalk, watching approach angles I couldn't cover without abandoning my position. Another moved to reinforce the north service door, bracing it with scrap we'd staged specifically for this moment. The woman stayed near the interior corridor, ready to block retreat paths if the outer layers failed. Everyone knew where not to go. The first impact hit the loading dock barrier harder than before. Weight multiplied by numbers, bodies pressing forward without coordination but with relentless force. Metal groaned under stress, bolts whining as they absorbed pressure. The sound rattled nerves, but no one panicked. Panic made noise. Noise made more of them. I watched hands force through gaps we'd measured carefully, fingers snapping back awkwardly when they met resistance. The dead learned nothing. But they didn't need to. They only needed time and mass. Shots weren't an option yet. Firearms would echo far beyond the factory, pulling in everything we'd avoided for weeks. We used gravity instead. Angles, narrowed space. When one barrier partially failed, it didn't open into freedom, it opened into confinement. Something fell. Hard. The sound ended abruptly. The pressure shifted as the dead followed momentum instead of intent, piling where resistance was strongest. That worked in our favor. The factory shaped them the way we'd shaped it. Every meter they gained cost them effort they couldn't recover. The second breach attempt came from the service door, exactly where we'd expected it. The reinforcement held, but only barely. One of the men leaned into it from inside, shoulder locked, teeth clenched as he absorbed the force. I saw fear flash across his face, not for himself, but for the rest of us, if he failed. That moment changed everything. This wasn't about defending my work anymore. It wasn't about protecting a place I'd claimed through effort. It was about holding space for other people who had committed to it alongside me. If the line broke, it wouldn't be my life alone that paid for it. I moved to support without thinking, adding weight where it mattered, trusting the others to hold their positions without me. The door shuddered again, then settled as pressure redistributed elsewhere. The dead adjusted, not strategically but instinctively, following the path of least resistance we refused to give them. Minutes stretched long and punishing. Sweat soaked through layers despite the cold. Muscles burned. Breath came shallow. Then gradually the impacts thinned. One by one, bodies lost momentum, redirected by obstacles and failure. Silence returned unevenly, like water draining from a flooded space. We didn't celebrate. We listened, counted, waited longer than comfort allowed. Only when the world stayed still did anyone speak. Voices low, clipped, practical. Damage was assessed immediately. One barrier compromised, one door warped. No injuries beyond bruises and shaking hands. The factory still stood. But something fundamental had shifted. I looked at the others, really looked at them, and understood what the defense had cost and what it had created. Responsibility had multiplied. Decisions I made now affected more than my survival. Authority carried weight that couldn't be shrugged off anymore. Defending the factory had been manageable. Defending people changed the equation entirely. As we reinforced the damaged sections together, working in silence broken only by necessary instruction, I felt the truth settle in. This place was no longer just a stronghold I maintained. It was a commitment. And commitments, once made, demanded more than planning. They demanded consistency, judgment, and the willingness to stand when retreat would be easier. The factory held that night, not because of walls alone, but because people chose to hold it together. That realization didn't comfort me. It anchored me. From that point forward, surviving here meant accepting that every defense would now be measured, not by whether I lived, but by whether we did. The factory stopped feeling temporary the day I realized I was making decisions for it instead of about it. I wasn't asking how long I could stay anymore. I was asking what it would need next. That shift was quiet, internal, and irreversible. I woke earlier than I used to, not because of fear, but because responsibility had settled into my body. There were checks to make, systems to observe, people to account for. The building demanded attention the same way a living thing does, through subtle changes you only notice if you care enough to look. A new vibration in a wall. A door that resisted differently. silence where there used to be sound. I began to measure time by maintenance instead of danger. Reinforce, repair, rotate, watch, eat, sleep, repeat. The rhythm didn't feel like routine in the old sense. It felt like alignment, as if my actions finally matched the reality around me instead of fighting it. The factory changed how I saw myself. I'd spent months reacting to collapse, defining survival as movement away from loss. Here, survival meant staying present. It meant acknowledging that permanence, even temporary permanence, required acceptance of consequence. If I made a mistake, there was no next town to absorb it. That weight forced honesty. I couldn't pretend exhaustion didn't matter. I couldn't ignore fear when it was justified. I learned the difference between courage and momentum, between stubbornness and commitment. The factory punished shortcuts and rewarded patience in ways the road never had. It also changed how I related to others. Authority didn't come from force here. It came from consistency, from showing up when things needed doing and staying calm when pressure rose. I stopped trying to sound certain. I focused on being clear. People trusted clarity more than confidence. There were moments when I caught my reflection in broken glass and barely recognized the posture looking back at me. Less coiled, more grounded, still alert, but not frantic. The place had given me something rare, context, a fixed point in a world that refused to hold still. I knew the factory could be lost. Fire, breach, betrayal, any number of endings waited just outside our control. That knowledge didn't undermine what we'd built. It sharpened it. We weren't pretending this place was forever. We were choosing it for now, fully aware of the risk. That choice reshaped my understanding of survival. It wasn't about outlasting everyone else. It was about building something functional in the middle of collapse and accepting responsibility for the people who relied on it. That responsibility didn't feel heroic. It felt heavy and necessary. I thought about who I'd been before all this, how easily I'd avoided attachment, how quickly I'd left places once they demanded more than shelter. The factory confronted that pattern and didn't allow it to continue. Staying required growth whether I wanted it or not. Even the silence felt different now. It wasn't emptiness. It was space we'd earned through effort and restraint. When the wind moved through broken vents, it no longer sounded like threat. It sounded like weather. The factory hadn't saved me. It had changed me by refusing to do that. It offered no illusion of safety, only the opportunity to participate in survival deliberately, instead of desperately. That difference mattered. Standing on the roof one evening, watching smoke rise faintly from distant parts of town, I understood that places don't change people by protecting them. They change people by demanding something back. This factory demanded attention, labor, restraint, and judgment. In return, it gave structure to days that would have otherwise dissolved into reaction. It turned survival into a practice instead of a chase. Whatever happened next, whatever forced us to leave or fight or adapt again, I knew this place had already done its work on me. I would never return to drifting without intention. The factory became more than walls and barriers. It became a reference point for who I was when I stopped running and started choosing to stay. That lesson would follow me beyond these walls, shaping every shelter, alliance, and decision long after this place fell. The longer we held the factory, the clearer its weaknesses became. Not all at once, not in a way that invited panic, but slowly, like cracks appearing in a structure you inspect every day. Strongholds don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they're finite. Every wall solved one problem and created another. Reinforcing entrances reduced access, but it also reduced flexibility. Narrowed corridors made defense easier, but escape harder. Every improvement tightened the system until it began to resist change. Adaptability narrowed as control increased. I started to notice how much of our safety depended on conditions we didn't command. Wind direction determined where sound traveled. Weather dictated how far we could see and how quickly we could move. One bad storm could mask approaching danger or collapse a section we couldn't afford to lose. The factory stood solid, but it stood inside a world that didn't care. Resources were another quiet limit. Every barrier needed maintenance, every tool dulled, every scrap piece we repurposed reduced what we could use later. Fortification felt permanent when we built it, but upkeep revealed how temporary it really was. There was no such thing as finished, only holding. People introduced limits too, even when they made us stronger. Fatigue accumulated unevenly. Not everyone recovered at the same pace. Injuries healed differently. Tension built in places that had nothing to do with defense and everything to do with proximity. Conflict didn't explode here. It simmered, waiting for the wrong moment. Authority was fragile in ways walls never were. Decisions carried consequences that rippled outward, sometimes invisibly. A choice made to conserve energy one day created vulnerability the next. Leading meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be fully predicted. Strongholds magnified leadership mistakes because there was nowhere for them to disperse. I thought about the illusion of permanence that fortification creates. The more effort invested, the harder it becomes to imagine leaving. That attachment is dangerous. It turns shelter into identity and makes retreat feel like failure instead of strategy. Strongholds don't just protect people. They convince them to stay longer than they should. The factory demanded loyalty without promising survival. That imbalance mattered. If conditions shifted beyond what we could manage, leaving would be necessary but psychologically difficult. I could feel that tension already, the quiet resistance to imagining departure even as I planned for it. Every defense plan we had included an end point, whether we spoke about it or not. A number of attackers, a level of damage, a loss we couldn't absorb. Those thresholds existed even if we never reached them. Ignoring them wouldn't erase them. Understanding limits didn't weaken the factory, it grounded it. It reminded me that strongholds were tools, not solutions. They delayed danger, they shaped outcomes, they never eliminated risk. I began planning exit routes again, not as an admission of failure but as respect for reality. Mobility hadn't stopped mattering, it had simply changed form. Staying was a choice we renewed daily, not a commitment carved into concrete. The factory taught me that survival wasn't about building something invincible. It was about building something honest enough to abandon when honesty demanded it. Walls that promise too much lie by omission. Strongholds always have limits because the world has no obligation to cooperate with them. Weather shifts. People change. Resources run dry. Attention moves on. Anything that lasts does so by adapting, not by hardening endlessly. As I walked the perimeter one evening, checking barriers that had held longer than expected, I felt a strange calm. Knowing the limits didn't make me anxious. It made me deliberate. The factory was still worth holding. For now. But I no longer confused that worth with permanence. The factory still stands as I think this through, which makes it easy to mistake endurance for security. Walls remain upright, barriers still hold, the routines we built continue to function. From the outside, it might look like we've solved something permanent in a world that refuses permanence. Living inside it teaches a different truth. Staying is a decision that has to be made repeatedly. Every morning we wake up here, we choose not to leave. That choice carries weight because it closes other options, narrows movement, commits resources. Safety, on the other hand, isn't something you decide. It's something you assess constantly. knowing it can vanish between breaths. The factory gives us time, not immunity. Time to see danger before it reaches us. Time to prepare responses instead of reacting blindly. That margin matters, but it doesn't remove risk. It only changes its shape. Threats arrive slower here, but when they do, they arrive heavier. I've learned not to confuse preparation with control. We plan, we reinforce, we watch, but none of that grants authority over outcomes. It grants influence, limited and conditional. Believing otherwise would turn confidence into complacency, and complacency has a way of opening doors no force could. There are nights when the factory feels almost peaceful. Wind moves through high vents without carrying sound. The dead wander elsewhere, distracted by noise we didn't make. In those moments, it's tempting to believe we've carved out a pocket of stability. I don't allow myself to linger there mentally. Comfort dulls vigilance faster than fear ever did. The people here understand that now. So, no one talks about the factory as a forever place. We talk about what it gives us and what it costs. We talk about contingencies without dramatizing them. Exit plans exist alongside defense plans, not as contradictions, but as complements. I think often about the difference between shelter and sanctuary. Shelter is practical. It acknowledges limits. Sanctuary pretends those limits don't apply. The factory is shelter, nothing more. Expecting it to be sanctuary would turn it into a trap built from our own expectations. Staying here has taught me restraint. Knowing when to invest effort and when to conserve it. Knowing when to reinforce and when to let a weakness exist because fixing it would create another. Safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the ability to recognize which dangers matter right now. The outbreak hasn't ended. It has stabilized into something quieter and more dangerous because of that quiet. The factory hasn't ended that reality. It has simply given us a place to face it without running every day. If we leave someday, it won't mean this place failed. It will mean its purpose was fulfilled. Strongholds don't exist to be eternal. They exist to buy time, perspective, and coordination. When those things are used up or no longer worth the cost, staying becomes risk, disguised as loyalty. As I stand near the reinforced gate at dusk, watching the sky darken beyond the trees, I feel neither safe nor trapped. I feel deliberate. The factory holds because we hold it, because we pay attention, because we refuse to believe it owes us anything. That understanding is what keeps us alive more than concrete ever could. Staying isn't the same as being safe. It's choosing to face danger from a position you've prepared, knowing that preparation is temporary, effort is ongoing, and survival depends on the willingness to leave the moment staying stops making sense. For now, the factory still earns that choice. Tomorrow, we'll decide again.